Needham's life turned completely around one very easily identifiable day in February 1938. And I'm going to concentrate on that day for a few moments because thanks to his habit of keeping an impeccable diary in beautiful, beautiful handwriting, we know exactly what happened on that day and the consequences of what happened. He was already, 1937-38, a most remarkable human being. I mean, he was a very tall, tousle-haired, bespectacled, energetic, loud, exuberant, flamboyant biochemist who looked somewhat like Harry Potter on speed. I mean, he was just, you see him and you'd think, that's what Harry Potter would have looked like in the 1930s. He was a brilliant biochemist. He was married to another brilliant biochemist called Dorothy Needham. He was a number of other things as well, which marked him out as somewhat different from his Cambridge colleagues. He was a Marxist. He had become deeply affected when he was 17 years old by the events in the Bolshevik Revolution in what became the Soviet Union. But he was also a very ardent Christian, and the combination, the intellectual balancing act that he had to perform to keep Marxism and Christianity together in his mind and spirit was something that informed all of his life. But he was also, as you mentioned, he was a gymnosophist, and if you don't know what a gymnosophist is, he was that was a polite word in the 1920s for nudism. He was very keen, he loved taking his clothes off in public because he felt that as a true socialist, once you've divested yourself of your silks and satins, then you're equal to your brother man or sister woman in all but the lumpy bits, basically. So there was that. He was also a Morris dancer. Well, exactly. Everyone is amused by this. He never Morris danced naked, you'll be relieved to hear. He was an accordion player too, and someone said, well, thank God, at least being a nudist, he wasn't a cymbals player, but I pointed out the accordion would have much the same impact, although slightly more slowly. He was a fellow of his college in Cambridge, Keyes College, the one that was made famous in that remarkable film, The Chariots of Fire. And indeed, you may remember the clock in the main quadrangle that they ran around. Well, that clock was important in his life because he was a chain smoker, but he wouldn't start smoking for the day until that clock had struck noon, and then he'd light up and smoke like industrial Manchester for the rest of the day. He occupied a room, a very celebrated room on staircase K in the central court, and room K1. It had been, when he took it over in the late 1920s, it was occupied by a very famous zoologist. Now, he died in 1995, it's occupied by someone who you'll all know, and if you go as a tourist to Keyes College, Cambridge, you can go to staircase K1 and peer through the mullioned windows and see that the occupant is Professor Sir Stephen Hawking, the cosmologist. So it's a rather nice indication of the continuity of intellectual life at Cambridge. But anyway, what I'm concentrating on is this one day, February the 17th, 1938, because on that day something happened which completely changed his life in a Western Australian way, as it were. He was married to Dorothy. He was also an inveterate womanizer. He loved women and had said to Dorothy when they got married that in 1924 that it was to be a modern marriage, and that was a signal for that both of them could pleasure themselves with other people so much as they wished to. Reading Dorothy's diaries, which I did, she never once strayed from the true course of matrimony. The same cannot be said of Joseph. He apparently hit the ground running the moment they came back from their honeymoon, and few Cambridge women of the day were totally free from his attentions. This became true in 1937 when a young Chinese woman called Lu Guizhen arrived from the city of Nanjing in eastern China to study under Dorothy, to study for a PhD. And Joseph was immediately attracted to her, and he was an extremely attractive man. The Harry Potter business went a long way, apparently. And the consummation took place on this 17th of February day. And you can see what happened because he noted everything in his university diary. The first thing Every reference to his wife he ever wrote down, he always wrote in Greek for some reason. So the phrase in Greek, Dorothy to Babbacombe, the only time I'm sure Babbacombe in Devon has ever been written in Greek, but this was the village in Devon that she came from, and he sent her off there to see her parents. So the coast was clear. He's now alone in Cambridge with Grey Jen. So what does he do? He takes her, first of all, to a movie, a film that's just opened in Cambridge. It has its first night there, Pearl Buck's The Good Earth, which, as you imagine, a refugee from China would find this very nostalgic, and I'm sure a cynic would view that it would make her somewhat, as she came out of the cinema, somewhat pliant. Well, to reinforce the pliancy, Joseph then took her, because he was a cunning old dog, to the Venetian, which is the best restaurant in Cambridge at the time. And I'm sure wine was taken in abundance, because he then took her back, all chronicled in the diary, to the rooms at Caius College, Stephen Hawking's rooms to be. And then you see in the diary 3 asterisks, which a person of normal prurient imagination can imagine something took place, which he didn't want. Possibly took place 3 times, but something took place. But it's not so much that that's important as what followed next in the diary, because you see underneath the asterisks, first in sort of halting pencil strokes, and then finally committed, once he's got the confidence, into ink, the first ever Chinese character that he ever writes in his life. Now, it's an important moment, but before I stress its importance, I want to ask you, maybe some of you have read the book, maybe I've let this out on a radio interview or something. Those of you who don't know, I'd love you to try and guess what you think that first character might have been. So, given the circumstances that I've described, what do you think the first Chinese character Joseph Needham ever wrote was?
Wow.
Wow, that's super. No one has, I mean, I've been now doing this for some months and no one has said, wow. Who said that? Who? Terrible mind you have. But no, it was not the Chinese for wow, whatever the Chinese is. Would anyone else like to hazard a guess? Woman, did you say? No, it wasn't woman. Life, did you say? Love. Well, the character I, as in woe I ni, I love you, is prominently displayed on the jacket of my book, but no, it is not love. Nor is it, for instance, the Chinese euphemism for sex, which is clouds and rain, one of those lovely, lovely Chinese isms. It was something much more prosaic. It was the character for cigarette. And you can imagine exactly the circumstances that, rather like in that film Now Voyager, he lit up 2 Players Navy Cut, which was his brand, and passed one to Grey Jen, and then exhaled, rolled the cylinder between his finger and thumb, and turned to her and said, Grey Jen, how do I write this in Chinese? And she showed him the 19 strokes that go to make up fragrant smoke, which is what a cigarette is called. And he wrote it. And he said, suddenly, the world shifted on its axis. He said, it was as if a door opened for me into an utterly alien universe, and I decided there and then to step through this door, and my life was never to be the same. I entered the glittering, crystalline world of Chinese ideographic writing, and I became obsessed with China. Well, this was the moment when he essentially abandoned biochemistry, although officially he remained a biochemist for the rest of his life, and suddenly embarked on this intense adoration for China. He learned the language. Grey Jen taught him painstakingly. He was a man who already spoke 7 languages, so he was linguistically very, very talented. And by the end of 2 further years of instruction, helped along by the professor of Chinese at Cambridge, a man called Gustav Halun, he could write and read 5,000 characters, which is very creditable, and he could speak, somewhat clumsily, but nonetheless, he could speak Chinese. Now, things were happening quite coincidentally in China, which suddenly made him, in his new capacity as someone fascinated by the Middle Kingdom, a needed commodity, because China was falling apart. I mean, China had been in the worst possible shape for the previous century or so. It had been gnawed away by foreign powers like us, the British, when we took Hong Kong in 1841, by the French, who took Shandong, the Germans took, Hainan, the Germans took Shandong, the Japanese had been in Manchuria and had begun a full-scale war in 1937, which is one of the reasons that Gui Zhen came to the comparative safety of England. The country, the revolution had happened in 1911, the emperor had been deposed, there was the warlordism, there was corruption, there was internal fighting, there was the communists versus the nationalists. I mean, people regarded China with contempt and disdain. This booby nation, Emerson called it once, a country that was only good for porcelain and silk and rhubarb and tea and nothing else. It made no major contribution to the world. Well, one of the corollaries of the Japanese invasion was that all the great universities of eastern China, in cities like Beijing and Shanghai and Tianjin, the Japanese desecrated them, vandalized them, attempted to destroy them. And the universities wouldn't allow themselves to be destroyed. And I think one of the great untold stories of China in the 1930s was that the vice-chancellors and the students of these antique centers of education decided that they would pack all their books and microscopes and Bunsen burners and blackboards up, and with the students and all the staff, they would go on foot or by mule thousands of miles across Western China and set themselves up anew as refugee universities in Western China. And so Beida, Beijing University, was set up in Chengdu, and Shanghai's universities ended up in Kunming, and so on and so forth. And they sent out corporately, these universities, in about 1941, a plea to the British government. Help us, we're dying here. The intellectual life of China is being snuffed out. We're caught between the Japanese on one side and the Himalayas on the other. You, the British, keep an air bridge to supply the military from Calcutta to Kunming. Can't you send scientific journals? Can't you send microscopes? All the things we need. And Winston Churchill himself made the decision that this should be allowed to happen, and that the British should therefore send an emissary, a diplomat, should be given the rank of counselor, and should be sent to China to assess what was needed and to begin sending it. And the person they chose was, not unreasonably, because he was so loud and boisterous and flamboyantly Chinese-speaking, this Harry Potter-like figure of Joseph Needham. They put him on a convoy ship in late 1942, sent him to Calcutta, and he arrived in Kunming, having been put in an American plane from Calcutta with a stop in Assam, with a revolver in his holster. He'd never had a gun in his life before. He was just a Cambridge biochemist, but they thought he ought to have a gun. And he arrived in Kunming. In Kunming, that's the second seminal moment, the second epiphany in Joseph Needham's life. Because he wrote in his diary, once again, beautiful handwriting, so easy to read, of how he sat smoking a cigarette on his first day in Kunming, watching an elderly Chinese gardener top grafting a plum tree. And as he looked and smoked, and there was the snow on the Himalayas, or the Tibetan ranges, there were beautiful, beautiful early spring day, he watched this man and thought, what this man is doing is different from what I remember my father doing with fruit trees in the back garden of our house in Clapham in London. I wonder, he said, how long they've been practicing this unique form of grafting. I'll speak to him. And he found he could speak to him. I mean, this was a revelation that a man, a gardener in Western China, could understand what he was saying, and he could understand the replies. And moreover, when he got back to the university where he was staying in Kunming, he could go to the Department of Botany and look at all the old documents, send telegrams back and forth to botanists, friends of his in Cambridge. Within a week, he had discovered that Chinese fruit grafting techniques were 600 years older than any recorded grafting technique in ancient Greece or anywhere else in the West. And this set him on a quest which was to occupy the next 3 years of his life, and indeed the rest of his life back in Cambridge, to find out what the Chinese had created first in the world, because he was convinced that this booby nation was not, in fact, a booby nation. It wasn't a nation that existed on the periphery of human civilization. It had, in fact, created most of civilization. And so, with Gui Zhen's help and urging, she was at this time in New York teaching, he decided he would look for all the evidence he could find of Chinese firsts. And he found them in abundance. I mean, there's a huge table in one of his books, 11 pages of things that we take for granted, but which all turned out to have been first discovered or invented by the Chinese. The classic is Francis Bacon's famous remark in the 17th century that the three inventions that most characterize modern humankind are gunpowder, printing, and the compass. Well, gunpowder, it turns out, not just for fireworks, had been invented and exploited by the Chinese in the 8th century. They had made bombs and cannon shells. Printing, which we arrogantly assume is something that Caxton or Gutenberg had invented in the 15th century, the Diamond Sutra, found in a cave at Dunhuang in Western China in 1907, dated, firmly dated, as having been printed with movable type 868 AD, 600 years before anyone in the West. And the compass, which we assume is a Levantine invention, that probably Arabs or merchants in the Eastern Mediterranean had started using the compass in the 13th century, not at all. The Chinese recorded use of the compass, south pointing admittedly, in the East China Sea in 1000 AD. So one after another, these inventions popped up. The stirrup, clearly Chinese, the chain, the rudder, vaccination against smallpox, ventilation fans, blast furnaces, playing cards, the game of chess. The Indians grumble about it, but there's no doubt at all that the Chinese did invent the game of chess. Toilet paper, for heaven's sake. You know, we assume that, I imagine, if we think about it, as a Victorian invention. Not at all. The Chinese, there are records of large squares of perfumed soft paper for that particular use being sold in 1341, along with smaller ones for the rather more delicately shaped imperial bottoms, hundreds of years before it was known in the West. So he spent 3 years traveling all over China, thousands and thousands of miles under the most extraordinarily difficult of circumstances, because there was a war going on, doing his work for the British government, but also amassing this catalogue of information, and also wondering to himself and then out loud, why, if the Chinese had invented so much so early, they were inventing, he calculated, at the rate of 15 profoundly important inventions a century, which is far greater than the Greeks at their most creative. Why had suddenly everything stopped in the 16th century? Why, though there clearly was a Chinese Euclid and a Chinese Archimedes, why was there never to be a Chinese Kepler or a Chinese Galileo or a Chinese Einstein? Why was modern science all essentially invented in the West? What happened? This is known as the Needham Question. So he came back to Cambridge in 1946. He was waylaid for a couple of years by Julian Huxley, who said, come to Paris because we want you to help set up UNESCO. UNESCO was going to be called UNESCO, the United Nations Educational and Cultural Organization, but Joseph argued vocally for science, which he believed to belong to all mankind, should be included. So even if he had never been famous for the book he was later to write, he's known as the man who put the S in UNESCO. He arrived in Cambridge in 1948 with all these ideas brimming in his head, and he wrote to Cambridge University Press in May and said, I want to write a book about how the Chinese invented human civilization. I can do it, he said, in 1 volume. 6 months later, he wrote back and he said, well, I'm not sure that I can do it in 1 volume, how about 3? And then 6 further months, so in 1949, he wrote, well, actually, I don't think 3 will do it, maybe 7. And then a year later still, well, 7, yes, but perhaps part 4 could be divided into 3 parts, and then maybe 5 parts. Anyway, by the time he died in 1995, the book that he had authored essentially on his own, although there were obviously collaborators, was 17 volumes long, is the longest, the biggest book on China ever written in the English language. The 25th volume, still adhering to his architectural plan, came out last week, and Cambridge University Press very kindly sent me a copy, so it'll be waiting for me in Massachusetts when I get home. This extraordinary book, which is called Science and Civilization in China, essentially changed the way an entire hemisphere came to regard another, because it trickled down from the academic community to the rest of us eventually, but it said incontrovertibly that the Chinese were central to the history of the world, and we must regard them not with disdain and contempt and good for rhubarb and silk and ceramics and tea only, but they're regarded as important for everything. So regard them now with awe, with admiration and respect. And I had an email just a couple of days ago from a Chinese chap in Beijing who said, we saw here in China this amazing opening ceremony for the Olympic Games, and I dare say many of you will have seen it too. Did you not realize, he said, that it was Needham, an Englishman, who told us about ourselves? We didn't know this. There was a vague understanding that we had made some contributions to civilization, but the catalogue, which of course is translated into Chinese, told us how great we are. And that is why, although Joseph Needham is little known, I had never heard of him until I stumbled across him when I was doing a book on the Yangtze about 20 years ago. And I dare say, although maybe I'll be proved wrong, not very many of you will have heard of Joseph Needham. Every educated Chinese knows this man. His Chinese name is Li Yuse. And if you were to go to any... I had a delivery man delivering Chinese food in Washington, D.C. the other day, and I said, I'm writing a book about Li Yuse, and he said, the most famous Englishman ever to have lived in China, the man who taught us about ourselves. You should be proud of yourselves in England of having nurtured such a fellow. Well, just to bring his life to a close and the story to a conclusion, I think one's got to remember that this all began because of a love affair, admittedly an adulterous love affair, but a love affair for a woman. Liu Guizhen was Joseph Needham's muse, really. Dorothy remained faithful to what she had said at the marriage ceremony in 1924, grimly complacent, never complained, and remained a good friend of Guizhen's for all of their lives. She died in 1987, aged about 90, whereupon Joseph married Guizhen, who had been waiting in the wings for 51 years. At the ceremony, he said, better late than never, and did not make a similar declaration to the one he had made in 1924, because I think he was a bit past that kind of thing. She died just 800 days later. She wasn't a well woman anyway, whereupon the old dog wrote 3 further letters to 3 further women saying, well, I'm back in circulation again. Would anyone like to? And they all very wisely, because by then he was 89 and beginning to creak a bit, they turned him down. The Queen gave him the Companionship of Honor in 1992, which is the highest civilian award that can be given, and he died in 1995. A fellow who, for many reasons, and maybe in the Q&A session we'll get to the reasons as to why he remains not particularly well known, but in China revered. And my hope is that this book will attempt to revive a reputation of a truly great man, and who saw above all that China would come back into the leadership of the world, and the civilization of the planet as a whole would ultimately change when everyone recognized and gave China her due. So thank you very much indeed.